Hello everybody, welcome to the patch 1310 rundown for amateur play. My name is Quintic, and as usual I'll be using my system of predictive criteria to help you understand the impact of this patch on lower leveled amateur play. Now, usually the changes that make the most difference for us are major systemic changes, right? Small champion adjustments don't usually shift our pools or our sub-pools, but strategies are updated when the game fundamentally changes, and the game is absolutely fundamentally changing, with 3 classes having like all of their items completely adjusted. Very few champion changes actually, and so I'll just get this out of the way. My approach to this particular patch will be don't radically change your champion pools immediately. Use some time immediately after the patch to just assess how your champions are feeling and get to know the new items and the new itemization systems on something that you already know and understand, right? I mean, obviously, if you are just going to have fun with trying something new, I'm not going to stop you. Fun is the biggest motivator for improvement anyway. Just expect that even though I think the game will change and that tiers will change dramatically, I think you should probably give it at least a week before you start making some major champion pool cycling decisions. So the context that they're giving for most of these champion changes is that a lot of champions that do not have AP ratios are gaining some AP ratios because they are candidates for building the new Rageblade, which is similar to the old Rageblade in that it has some AP on it. So they're trying to make the item feel like a little less bad in those contexts, right? What we're expecting to see is that none of these champions, like, gain new builds. There is a possibility of considering Nashers on some of these if the changes are good enough, but let's go ahead and see what those changes are going to be, right? Akshan's passive magic damage on 3rd stack is going up, so there's a 60% ratio on it. There is also a movement speed ratio on his Q. Sorry, there is an AP ratio on the movement speed of his Q. And his shield value now scales non-linearly, mirroring base stat growth, so he's gaining quite a lot more of it at late levels. So I guess they're trying to tone down Akshan's lane bullying like a little bit, which is a bit of a surprise. Obviously, since this magic damage on 3rd stack is the only part of Akshan's passive that is like, or Akshan's entire kit that is receiving a ratio. There's no threat of AP Akshan whatsoever, and so we're not expecting major changes. It's exactly as described on the tin. With this part, this is something that the Akshan players are going to have to feel out a little bit. Like, are they exposed to more level 6 all-ins? But because this is a type of change that we have not studied like how to assess yet, I'm just going to leave it as it is, and we'll focus on the big stuff. So Akshan players, keep an eye on this. Feel it out. Let me know how it feels. We're not expecting much. Kalista, she's gaining an AP ratio on the slow of her E. The physical damage has a 20% ratio, which is pretty low. And the additional stack damage also has a 20% ratio. Yeah, is there any possibility of just like abrupt rend burst? I mean, you still need to stack it via attack speed. I mean, is there any possibility of Nashers on this? You're gaining 20 damage per spear on a Nashers, right? We don't have to use our full ratio assessment tricks where we're understanding it's like snowballing and like scaling stuff just because there's pretty much one item, right? It's only Nashers and it's only the 30 AP from Rageblade, and will that do pretty much anything? Nope. So Kalista's unchanged. Kindred Wolf is getting some AP ratios. It is 20% AP on Wolf's Frenzy magic damage. That's per bite, which is very, very low. And it's the slow on Mounting Dread. So again, no reason to build AP on Kindred, exactly as described. Now, Neeko is the only champion who's gaining changes that are not related to that Guinsoo's change. And honestly, they're a little startling. Now, Neeko's win rate across the board in solo queue is very, very low. I believe that at least a part of it is a symptom of people trying to overuse her deception mechanics because, you know, as I said in day 1 Neeko, there's a time and a place for honest League of Legends even while playing this champion, right? Playing jungle Neeko, you know, the clear is very, very fast. The first clear is a little bit unhealthy even through the shape splitter optimizations. So what they're doing is they're giving her plus 5 damage. It now scales by 15 per rank, 95 bonus damage to monsters at rank 5. Do you realize how insane this is? That's pretty much 300 bonus to monsters per Q at rank 5. And this is plus 15. This is plus 30. This is plus 45, right? This is plus 25. So Neeko's clear is becoming quite a bit better. The speed wasn't the issue. The health was the issue, so speed can kind of, like, help that a little bit. Sure. And then Puff Blossom was not doing enough damage. She did fall off as a champion quite hard, right? She was a very extreme tempo champion. Gain your speed, make your play, try to win off that play. Now the scaling will be a little bit better because they overshot the damage reduction on this. And Vayne, Q receives an AP ratio of 50%, which is definitely the most generous ratio that we've seen so far. And yeah, I just don't think that she has enough items to really capitalize on this. It's just a little bit of extra damage for the AP that she ends up building on Rageblade. So, we're not expecting any big changes from that one. Neeko is the only champion we really have to care about at all. The rest of them will not feel very significant. Okay, so now that we've sped through champions, it's time to get to what we've all come here for, the items. So, first of all, I'm going to contextualize the current Marksman Itemization system, right? Previously, Marksman Itemization was centered around the capstone, Infinity Edge, Navori Quickblades, and Rageblade. So they had to make their mythic decision, and they had to make their capstone decision. Now, Marksman Itemization was centered entirely around finding an efficient and high damage path to that non-mythic capstone, usually resulting in a direct mythic to capstone build path, but often led to occasional variations when the utility of another item would justify that capstone spike, right? The capstones were not rush candidates. Rageblade could be argued to be a rush candidate in some instances, but basically they all required like some degree of existing crits to optimize, right? So Marksman got on-curve items, those that comfortably fit into the 3-item core, building towards and supporting the capstone, and then post-curve options that can't realistically be built until the capstone is complete, stuff like GA, stuff like, I mean, if you had a cleaver champ, like a Maw, you know, which is also why Marksman ended up having the viable option of steel caps, because even though steel caps are not typically a great armor option, they were actually the best that Marksman had available. The on-hit options were genuinely fine, but they were underground. Like, Rageblade was a good item, but Blade of the Ruined King didn't supplement it as well as you would have liked. Collector was completely underground. Stormrazor was not something. Like, Collector totally lost its niche after Infinity Edge became a second item. Capstone meta was, like, a thing, pretty much. And then, so once you finish your curve, once you finish your 3 items, you can kind of opt into some of these defensive options outside of the curve. And once you think you have enough damage, you know, Marksmen they never run out of damage. You are able to opt into, like, proper, regular tank items, right? So it was always capstone second or third, depending on the specific items, right? You'd pick from this small pool of crits, and there were very, very, very few variations, right? Now, however, I believe the capstones have actually become your mythics, and the former mythics are just items in the pool. So now Marksman Itemization would appear to be much, much, much more open. We no longer have to really care about the concept of the curve as it was defined previously. I mean, we still have to care about an efficient path to our damage. So, full disclosure, this is my second time through all of these items, because on my stream, we just went through every one of these in excessive detail. It took like 2 hours to do all the theory crafting and talking about it, but I've decided to kind of run through a second time, because it'll be easier for me to contextualize to you guys, just now that we don't have to think of an item without the context of everything else, right? So, Bloodthirster, it costs 3,200 gold. The build path is unchanged, the AD is unchanged, the crit chance is unchanged, and the lifesteal is increased. However, the shield is gone, so it is a worse raw defensive item. However, it does grant you AD while above 50% health. This AD starts scaling at level 13, so it starts to come online very late. Bloodthirster previously was a viable rush item on half-casters, right? If you were a champion who really just gained excessive laning power through raw AD and the raw lifesteal, because it was just more efficient to keep generating that health and to just use shield bows 1 moment of power, you were very good with Bloodthirster. So like champs like Misfortune, Aphelios, Draven, those champions still may have rush value for Bloodthirster. May, though. That is a big may, because it is hard to compete against the new mythic system, right? So what I will say It is a worse durability item. It is a worse defensive item. But if you are like an anchor champion who inherently is a little bit tanky and you can inherently survive things, Bloodthirster is still pretty good. If you have enchanters on your team, you have somebody specifically a shielder, Bloodthirster is amazing because it basically just turns you into a generic enchanter synergy champ like Xinjiao or Olaf, right? It'll still be totally good. It is a good item. It's just the context is a little different. We will still find a lot of value on third plus item. It's just those rush conditions that are kind of looking a little iffier. There are probably going to be lanes for it. Like if you're playing Misfortune into Extreme Poke, right? That'll probably be a good Bloodthirster game. Draven in the same context, right? So Galeforce. Galeforce is the only previous mythic that remains a mythic. Now, it has to compete against Infinity Edge and Quickblades and Rageblade, and that is a tall order. How is it going to compete against those? Well, it still costs 3,400. It is now a BF Zeal item. 55 AD, 15% attack speed, 20% crits. It now has movement speed inherently. Now, the cooldown is back down to 90 seconds, which is appealing, and all of the damage is the same, except for, where is it? Yes, there's this up to 250 based on crit bonus physical damage. So, the only champion that's going to want to value this outside of the defensive context is kind of like an assassin-esque marksman. So, Lucian and Akshan come to mind as champions who could still gain value from this. Offensively, but defensively, it's kind of scary to use as a trade-off, right? Because let's say I'm playing Xayah, and I need my defenses, but that means I'm giving up my Infinity Edge or my Quickblades, right? And what does that mean for my damage, right? Now, we'll see the curves afterwards are pretty okay. Like, we still do opt into Kraken after this, but it's a little bit scary. Worth noting that, we're going to see a BF into Noon Quiver into Infinity Edge pretty often on a lot of champions, but the old school version of doing it was BF Zeal. This item builds out of BF Zeal and is technically the only item that is going to be able to take both of those components and generate an immediate spike. So that's very important to note. It is also kind of a snowball item just off build path alone. Guinsoo's Rageblade is absolutely insane. We thought it would be much, much, much better than it was. It's still quite outstanding, but it looked broken at first glance. Why? Well, it's a mythic item. It now costs 3,200. It is quite a bit more expensive. There's an Amp Tome, a Rage Knife, and a Pickaxe in it. It now has AD. It now has ability power. It loses some attack speed, but because of the Seething Strike, gaining up to 32% additional attack speed, once you get just a couple of hits, you will have more attack speed than before, and then you just have all these stats on top of it. Attacks apply 30 magic damage on hit, so Rageblade has its own on-hit value and is more compelling as a rush. It had that before, technically, thanks to the crit damage, which it no longer has. There is no crit chance on this item. Technically, what it had before was more, so this is the property I thought was broken. It simply isn't. It still has its crit damage conversion. It does have one of the best types of mythic passives in the entire game. Percent pen passives are really, really good mythic passives. Now, worth pointing out is what they did to Rage Knife as well. It is slightly more expensive. It has unchanged attack speed, but it also has its own on-hit damage, and it has a version of Seething Strike, which amps attack speed. Rage Knife was a garbage component to rush initially. It is quite a lot better now, right? Which does mean Guinsoo's rush feels good. And that's really huge for on-hit champions because Blade of the Ruined King was not super appealing, mainly because of its interactions with lethal tempo, right? Melee champions and melee Bork, really good, 12% current health damage and a really good lethal tempo, while ranged champions had less value of that, and then 9% current health damage, and then a kind of underwhelming lifesteal value, and it just didn't feel good to purchase at its price point. On-hit champions would have wanted to rush Guinsoo's anyway if they could get away with it, and now it's much easier to get away with it. The damage is much better. So, that's super, super, super good for Guinsoo's users, right? Hearthbound Axe now has a little bit more AD, and it's a little cheaper, so it's easier to fit into the components of some items. We'll see that later. Immortal Shieldbow is a little bit complicated. It's now a legendary item. 3,000 gold, no longer grants any attack speed, which is weird because that means the existing niche, the existing conversation between Bloodthirster and Shieldbow gets a little muddied, because previously Shieldbow was only better than BT on champions that actually value the attack speed, and it was uniquely good as a third item for on-hit champions, just because on-hit builds tend to have a little higher durability, and they get most of their damage, you know, early from the raw on-hits. The value of the shield is reduced, and it only starts scaling at level 10, and the lifeline stats, that's now attack speed, which isn't amazing. So Shieldbow presents us with a complicated problem. Shieldbow Rush looks quite awful. Shieldbow second even looks quite bad on paper. Shieldbow looks like it firmly cements itself as like the post-curve type of item alongside GA, alongside Maw. You know, something that you build once your 2-item, 3-item spike are like solidly online. You have all the damage you could ever need, and now like the utility items become generally stronger. What does that mean for Samira, though? And what does that mean for Yasuo? And what does that mean for, like, these hardbound Shieldbow users, right? I think Zeri will survive, but, like, these champions who get in your face and, like, really, really rely on this. It's now the only, like, true defensive item, you know, excluding, you know, it's now the only true generic defensive item that can proc in every fight, right? Because GA can't proc in every fight. Maw doesn't affect everything. BT is just not that item anymore. So, you know, like the generic hyper carry, like let's take Jinx for example. She's really going to want to be building BT, Noon Quiver, Infinity Edge, Kraken Slayer in like most cases, right? So I mean, that is enough, and she would like to go at LDR on 3, and then a Shieldbow on 3 could actually be a good option for her, right? So that does tell us it's not inherently post-curve only. You know, like, the concept of the curve has changed. Previously, we would have to build our 3 items to supplement and support our capstone, which are now our mythics. Yeah, it's just gotten a little complicated. I'll take this moment to kind of just step in and, you know, like, include the context that I forgot to include. We've been talking about all of our items. What matters for ADCs, right? Why did we used to go BF Zeal back in the day? Well, because attack damage is basically the be-all, end-all, right? Attack speed does nothing unless it's backed up by AD or by on-hits. And then excessive attack speed does nothing into durable targets. So you have to kind of, you know, play this balancing act, right? So the system is very much about our raw stats, right? We just didn't have to kind of perceive it through the lens of raw stats as much because Kraken was just our one-stop shop. Gale was just kind of our one-stop shop. But, like, fundamentally not that much has changed when you look at it from that perspective, right? So, I mean, if you're playing Jinx and you would still be fine with building an RFC in the right position. You would still be fine with building a Shieldbow. Yeah, so you can start building this as early as 3rd, and we'll have to do some problem solving on, like, Yasuo, Samira, and just see what happens, right? Infinity Edge is completely unchanged, except for it's a mythic, and the crit damage is just a stat increase, right? So you want to rush this item in a lot of cases if you are a crit champion. It's rushable, it's very strong if you rush it. Granted, the crit damage doesn't do too much until you have a little bit of crit, like extra crit chance behind it, but that's why in the old days we used to build a Zeal to supplement it. That's why we still can build a Zeal to supplement it, but as we'll see in the State of Kraken, why it's more likely that Noon Quiver becomes the item. Actually, no, we'll be on Noon Quiver into straight Infinity Edge. Because Noon Quiver is just the ideal component that we didn't have back in those days. Yeah, okay, yeah. So that's what's going to happen. By the way, Infinity Edge, very plainly just a excellent rush item. Now, one thing I failed to consider on the day was that Infinity Edge cannot be a direct Kraken Slayer replacement, right? Because even though back in the old days we did BF Zeal into Infinity Edge, that is an inherently slower spike than our modern Kraken Slayer. Noon Quiver directly into some beautiful stats, directly into an amazing, immediately impactful passive with a lot of damage on Kraken Slayer. That is quite a lot faster than 35% critical strike damage, which doesn't do anything until it's supplemented by a bit more critical strike chance via whatever component. So, you know, I mentioned Noon Quiver directly into IE, but that actually fails to consider that we need the extra Cloak of Agility, and now things are looking a little complicated, right? So the Zeal is actually better in that sense. So although I do stand by the idea that with components we can generate an Infinity Edge Rush, it is slower than an immediate lethality spike, than an Essence Reaver, than a Bloodthirster, than a Galeforce, which is not universal, but as I mentioned, is the better snowballing option. So the implications are that hyper carries still come online later without immediately great legendary rushes for them, and they've lost some defensive capabilities as well. So that is a big, big deal. You're going to hear me throughout the rest of this video talk about how the Infinity Edge and the Quickblades rush is kind of hard to beat. When it eventually comes online, I still kind of stand by that. It's just the path to it is awkward and leaves you susceptible to interaction. So in slow metas, I expect us to see it. But that's just kind of the disclaimer I wanted to get out there with some context I've thought about and realized in the days since I recorded this and while I was editing. Kircheis, they're building the Energizer system to be more AD focused, so the attack speed is gone, the AD is present, the initial damage is actually lower, mainly because all the Energizer effects have like big scaling effects on them now. Kraken Slayer is now a legendary. It costs less, the AD is lower, the attack speed is slightly higher, a Noon Quiver, Cloak of Agility, Recurve Bow rather than Pickaxe, and every third attack now has a 60% total AD ratio, which is higher than the 45% bonus that it had before. This is now an AP ratio, and subsequent triggers on the same target increase this damage by up to 100% for 40 plus 120% total AD, which is excellent, plus 90% AP. Now, granted, it is magic damage rather than true, but effectively what this creates is a situation in which Phantom Dancer and Kraken Slayer are competing directly against each other. I'll scroll directly to Phantom Dancer here. We'll see it's basically unchanged. It still is a premier attack speed stat stick, right? But let's say we're Jinx again, right? Because Jinx is just our generic crit hyper carry who sets all the rules, right? Let's say we're Jinx. We build our Infinity Edge, and now we're kind of deciding between Kraken and PD. Now, originally I thought maybe they can supplement each other, right? But then if we're building Kraken PD, we kind of do get into an excessive attack speed territory without actual on-hits behind it. And that's awkward for when there are hyper tanks, right? It can still be quite good into squishy champions. In fact, it will be good if the entire enemy team is squishy. You can go, i.e. Kraken PD, right? But in any case in which you have to do like any tank busting, you're going to have to recognize that LDR is in the system, right? And that probably takes priority over Phantom Dancer. And you have to recognize that maybe BT is going to be necessary even without the shield because you have an enchanter and it's just necessary to do that. Maybe the Shieldbow is useful because there's a lot of divers, right? And basically what I'm getting at is Phantom Dancer, in the comparison between Kraken and Phantom Dancer, would appear to be more expendable, right? It would appear that Kraken Slayer is the biggest immediate spike, right? Obviously, the single target DPS is the greatest. The one thing that PD does have over Kraken Slayer is that this ramps on a per target basis, while PD just gives you the attack speed and lets you keep rolling with it, right? But I hypothesize that in the general case, Kraken over PD is desirable, and we'll kind of play through there, right? This item is still amazing. It's still going to define a lot of AD carry builds. But please note, this is not nearly as strong as it was on a first item basis, even though we now recognize that Infinity Edge Rush is not like 10 out of 10. We can't just go straight back to Kraken. It is a total AD ratio with substantially less base damage. And that total AD ratio needs to be backed up by experience. You need your base stats and by other items. So not the same spike, still very good. Mercsim is gaining some magic resistance, which is very nice, but it's not going to create conditions in which we build Mercsim when we wouldn't anyway, so, you know, because it would be more desirable to build actual raw MR, because that also gives us some health, right? Mortal Reminder has some more AD. It now has greater AD than LDR. It is still, you know, somewhat fine. It's still kind of appealing on third item, but it's more efficient for the mages to be applying with Oblivion Orb. Like, if you're desperate, Mortal Reminder is still good. It still has good percent pen. You know, it's not a bad option by any means. It's still fine on third, but it's a situational, like, obligation thing, right? Quickblades. So Quickblades also now are a mythic. Quickblades also apply immediately. Like, they don't have any condition to come online. You just do get this non-ultimate ability refund, and you do just get increased ability damage. The cool thing is, Quickblades are technically, if you want to think of it from this way, better on paper to rush without a supplementary component than Infinity Edge. Because Infinity Edge is amping the damage, but Quickblades, you know, you just get the value immediately. So keep that in mind. It's still likely that you'll want to supplement with some attack speed on most Quickblades users, right? But if you're playing something like Lucian, for instance, granted, Lucian is still one of the very few champions who would value offensive Galeforce, but, you know, that's an option. Noon Quiver doesn't build into Mythics, that's all it said. We already talked about PD and Rage Knife, so let's talk about Rapid Fire Cannon. Rapid Fire's niche is preserved, right? It is still good when you need to take pot shots on people. 3,000 gold, it now has AD, and the attack speed is lower, in line with the goal of making Energizer items more AD focused, because they're more of a burst style. It just makes more sense, right? Energized attacks will deal less damage initially on Rapid Fire Cannon. They really just care about, the raw AD and the poke. Energizer items as a whole, you'll see we've been working through these a little bit. It is kind of its own tree. We'll hold off on talking about that until Staikk Shiv shows up, right? Recurve Bow is now only 1 dagger and is cheaper and builds into more components. It has just magic damage on hit, and that's actually pretty cool because on hits as a whole, there's a lot of Energizer effects, there's a lot of on-hit effects that are just magic damage and make you a little harder to itemize against. Runaan's is quite a bit better. It's a little bit more expensive, but it now has its own native on-hit, and Runaan's is an on-hit synergy item that applies all your on-hits through all of its bolts, right? And on top of that, the Wind's Fury bolt damage is greater. So in the conditions where Runaan's would be a good item, it is a noticeably better item, right? If people are going to clump up, it is quite good, right? So going back to our Jinx example, in the conditions where Runaan's jumps out as an appealing item, then, we could maybe go Infinity Edge, Kraken, Runaan's, right? We could go Infinity Edge straight into Runaan's if that's necessary, and, that could just be our attack speed, and we could go Runaan's into LDR as well, right? So Runaan's does kind of interact with the crit system like that, and it can be a competitor to Kraken, and it's more likely a direct competitor to PD, and it also just integrates itself very nicely, as before, unchanged, into on-hits. Staikk Shiv is back. It still is a big nuke item. Applies 60 to 170 bonus magic damage on its energized, which will chain to up to 12 targets and deal noticeably higher damage to minions. It has some AD, it has some attack speed, it has some crit damage, or crit chance rather, and notably the Energizer effects only apply to the first target, and then Shiv's damage will apply to everything else, right? You can't just stack Energizers and have Shiv apply all of them to everybody. Only to the one guy who you one-shot, right? So yeah, now it's worth talking about Energizer items. Once we incorporate the context of Stormrazor, the stats aren't noticeably increased and the price is increased. So it's like, okay, this item's still trash, right? Wrong. Because now instead of dealing flat damage, it has a 65% total AD ratio. I think the math worked out to 140 AD necessary to reach the old value, which is not particularly high, especially on AD stackers. Energizer items are really good on burst champions or half casters or champions that just stack AD because they don't need attack speed. Now that it has movement speed rather than a slow, it's really good at synergizing with Rapid Fire Cannon and just taking pot shots and getting out. It's good for assassination patterns and just get out, right? These are not items that the generic attack speed carry is going to be looking at, right? This is going to be more so something like Draven. This is going to be more so something like Aphelios. Aphelios is going to love the Energizer system for sure. So it's kind of within its own defined niche. I can't imagine Stormrazor being amazing before third item because you really, really need its ratio to make it hurt. That said, in the absence of immediate legendary rushes, Stormrazor is what people have tried defaulting to, and it is, at least in the first few days of the patch, what is winning in solo queue. So, I still don't see the justification for it on first item outside of everything else might suck, but it's what people are doing. And they say early PvP focused. I don't think it's actually going to achieve those goals, right? Now, that complicates things a little bit because it's like, well, if IE Rush with Energizer effects are so good on half-caster like AD champions, what does that mean for the Collector? And what does that mean for general lethality? What does that mean for Eclipse, right? The Collector is going up to 18 lethality, which is good, but it doesn't change the fact that its only niche is to curve from a lethality item into crit, which was necessary when Infinity Edge could not be purchased until you had 20% crit. So if you were the type of champion that likes to start Eclipse for whatever reason, and then you still wanted the Infinity Edge, this was your transition point. That was the only value it ever had, right? There was basically just not much of a place for it in the old system. In the new system, though, where you can just buy Infinity Edge whenever you damn well please, I have a hard time, even with 18 lethality, which is a good number, I have a hard time seeing any value. Like you can still use it to transition out of crit into lethality, but if you're doing that, then, you know, like, Flat Pen becomes more effective if you have previous Flat Pen on top of it, which is usually more of a snowballing thing. You usually build it on a curve. You don't just decide to do that in endgame when the armor is kind of there already, right? So it's hard to find a place for this item. Champions like Varus, who become full casters on lethality, right? Who are picked for their poke. Champions like Ezreal, who are not going to want to spec into crit for Energizer stuff. Like, splashing lethality is still going to be useful on them, and in fact, we'll see a mythic later that is perfect for them. But then I can't see a reason for those champions to build the Collector either, because they don't want to transition back into crit. So, you know, I think this item's homeless, but in sticking with the theme of things that I missed that I didn't need to miss if I just looked at my own notes before running the stream, champions did still have that serrated Dirk Rush for snowball potential, and Collector is still good at that. It's now much better at that. On top of that, Veigar V2 had a demonstration where on squishy targets who just stacked a bunch of armor, before Giant Slayer comes in, Collector can actually win the Collector versus LDR debate, up to the break-even point of 90 armor, I think, and that is a very, very significant change, right? And that's something that was irresponsible of me to not check. So if Giant Slayer is not going to come into play, Collector is better than LDR. That's its niche, regardless of the curve issues. And then finally, Zeal, which is one of the best components in the game, is simply just slightly worse, and it's still quite good. So basically, the conclusions that we draw, right? PD has to really fight for its life. We've seen the conditions where Bloodthirster can be good. You know, you have an enchanter, or you just are a naturally tanky marksman, right? Energizer items are going to have, like, their own champions that just really enjoy them. I would like to investigate Yasuo again, because durability in the system as a whole is down. Survivability is down. Durability is down. It is harder to get your early defenses, especially with Shieldbow being bad early. So that kind of incentivizes Yasuo to go in more a direction where he's just trying to hard one-shot you. Return of Shiv for him, right? That gives Yone some extra options for playing actual assassin patterns, although he's not going to be as desperate because he's an outstanding Blade of the Ruined King user, right? Ultimately, we're still approaching the system from a similar, like, 3-item core perspective, right? You pick up your, like, you try to set up with your Infinity Edge, Quickblades, Rageblade, like, the crit champions will still be looking from here or here and might take a situational BT, The rapid fire cannon is still available to everybody if necessary, if that happens to be the play pattern that works for you this game, and then Shiv and Stormrazor are on their own types of champions. Runaan's is still available for all, like, attack speed carries on, like, 2nd or 3rd, if the situation calls for it, but, you know, now on-hit champions as a whole can just go Guinsoo's directly into Wit's End, directly into, like, hard durability. The right champion can splash a Nashor's Tooth in here, right? We still have our late curve items, like the ones that are kind of just, like, closing out our Kraken IE sort of core, you know, that's unchanged. The very champ specific options are unchanged, except, you know, as we've talked about these options, like, I really couldn't tell you. And then once you finish your core, you can start opting into the typical defensive items with Shieldbow joining the roster. And once you've decided you have enough damage, because marksmen never run out of damage, you just go into your hard tank items if that's what you choose, right? If that would be most useful in the moment. So, honestly, even though a lot about the system has changed, the fundamentals are still in place, and, like, less has changed than you think. There's just some, like, edge cases that are missing their durability and will have to find a solution. And there are some champions who just, like, go absolutely ballistic with these Energizer items, right? Jhin, Aphelios, Draven is a concern, right? Just... Some champs are having a field day with the fact that these AD-heavy options are nice and good and appealing, right? Assassin items are getting less extensive changes, so I think I'm more comfortable making bigger statements before I've gone through absolutely everything, right? Because I remember most of what I saw on the PvE deploy. So let me just put it this way, right? Assassin itemization was really, really bad, right? When you're in a position where Yumu's versus Axiom is the primary damage conversation on your second item, that doesn't bode well, because those items were fine, but not amazing. Worse, ranged lethality users really did not have good mythic options. If the ranged lethality user was not an Eclipse user, they were obligated to rush the next best legendary, which was, in most cases, Youmuu's, right? Now, we also have Umbroglaive on top of that. Where does Umbroglaive fit in? Well, it's pretty weak as a combat item. And I'm on record on one of my TikToks with saying that in at least coordinated competitive play, I do not think that its active actually translates to very much. In solo queue, where it's harder to communicate and make sure everybody has the same information through just intuition and reading the map through Fog of War, it is better. But I was in a position where, like, you know, a lot of melee lethality supports were much better off with Youmuu's or with Mythic Rushes. Umbral was kind of just the item for ranged lethality supports if they weren't supposed to be carries, right? And then, like, we had Eon. Eon was a great defensive item. But then, like, what do you do beyond that? Like, you're just stuck, right? You have Serylda's eventually. So Assassins have just been poaching a lot of bruiser items, right? Black Cleaver has been, like, I mean, it's just an amazing items, which is why they're looking at it, because it's just so much better than their own items. But yeah, like, let's look at the options, right? Prowlers and Eclipse were so much better than everything else that it was not even funny. And then underneath the Youmuu's versus Axiom thing, like, yeah, you really don't have it, because the other competitors for raw damage were Serylda's, Cleaver, Monamune, which are either champion dependent or late game. The defenses, right? Eon was great, but then, like, Maw, GA, DD, Silvermere, like, we're getting into bruiser itemization again, because it's the best they've got. Of the util items, like Serpents, it was profoundly understated. Umbroglaive, profoundly understated, right? Like, everything just limited your output, and even though a lot of items built out of Serrated Dirk, So, let's see what problems they were able to address with that, right? Of all those problems I mentioned, here's the solution to one of them. Ranged lethality users just have a really good mythic now. Your spells deal up to an additional 15% bonus damage based on the target's missing health. Everybody, welcome to your artillery lethality option. Here it is. If you're a poke champion, and you're not like an Eclipse synergy thing like Jace, you know, this is Varys' item. This is Ezreal's late item still. Like, he doesn't have to just go into Prowlers and sit on some awkward item, right? And then when the champion you've damaged within the past 3 seconds dies, you no longer become invisible, you become untargetable by non-structures. So you can't just sneak away. It's a little worse on the melee assassins, because they can, you know, track your movement. But on a ranged champion who values their survivability, that's quite good. Now, on melee champions, is there going to be much of a value for this? Well, Kha'Zix was the only big user, and obviously it's not useful for him anymore. Not the same way. And we'll see why Youmuu's is just so outstanding on proper assassins in a moment. But is there anybody else who we should pay attention to here? Somebody who would, like, one of the assassins who is probably more likely to stay in combat than the others. Well, Qiyana, actually. Yeah, because Qiyana is most likely to stall throughout a fight and just keep fighting it out, right? She doesn't have to immediately leave. She can just shroud up. So it could potentially be a decent option on Qiyana. I'm going to kind of go down to some of the divers and see if any of our lethality users would be happy with this. It's probably worth at least exploring on Hecarim, even though he's more likely to value the tank mythics anyway, because his legendaries are so good. Yeah, if you've got lethality users here, you're most likely to find Duskblade users, right? The point is, great for poke champions and great for lethality champions who would be purely damage focused, but have, like, the means to stay in combat for a little bit, right? So, honestly, not a troll item. Is worth talking about a Duskblade versus Youmuu's comparison just in case it isn't the solution to all our ranged champions' problems. We might still be stuck in that trap. Oh, wait, we don't have Duskblade versus Youmuu's in that sense anymore. It would be Duskblade versus Axiom. Yeah, Duskblade wins that, for sure. Even though Axiom is a haste stick. Yeah, okay, perfect. Prowler's Claw no longer has its dash active. This is really, really detrimental to the combos of certain champions like Pyke, right? This is really detrimental to Renekton and to Rek'Sai. But let's see what everybody else is given. A 3,000 gold item with 55 AD, 15 ability haste, and 15 lethality. So, as a raw lethality stat stick, slightly worse than Axiom, which is concerning. Now, unlike Axiom, it has a useful passive. So, after dashing, blinking, or exiting stealth, your next attack on an enemy champion deals 85 plus 45% AD, halved for ranged. Well, not quite halved, actually. It's just reduced for ranged. And if the owner is melee, the attack also slows by 99% for 0.5 seconds. So the simplest conclusion to draw from this is it just slots exactly where old Yumu's was, as just your generic follow-up lethality item, right? If you build your Mythic, your default damage would be Prowlers after that. Unless you have absurd BC synergy, right? Unless you need Edge of Night, right? Unless some, like, so there's now a Prowlers versus Axiom debate rather than a Yumu's versus Axiom debate, which, you know, the default would then be, if it's slotting in exactly, the default would be that Prowlers wins that debate. There is literally nothing more to say than if you can proc this, it's your generic legendary second, right? Yumu's Ghostblade becomes a mythic. This is just going to be the mythic that the generic assassin builds. Why? Well, I will explain why. 3,100 gold, 60 AD, 20 A haste, still has the 18 lethality that it did before. Moving generates spectral shards. For each stack, gain 0.4 movement speed up to 40. So you no longer just natively get Haunt, you have to build it up like a DMP. However, at maximum stacks, you gain 8 to 20 lethality. This item grants up to 38 lethality on its own. Name a champion with 38 base armor. You know, like, or a squishy champion who would be your priority target. The stacks reset 3 seconds after dealing damage, so which means you still get all of the effects of this item for 3 seconds after entering combat, which makes it much more useful than the pattern of, like, DMP, right? You get good move speed, good target access, absurd lethality, and then you get to use it during your entire burst combo, right? Now, worth noting that this now reveals to me that if your combat pattern is longer than 3 seconds, that's also probably a condition to go Duskblade, which means, let's say, Shadow Assassin Kayn, right? Do we want Duskblade on him as well? Because he's either taking more than 3 seconds to one-shot you given the duration of his ultimate, or in slower games, he's playing for poke of his own, right? W poke through a wall. So that's worth noting, but either way, there's nothing more to say than this is a tremendous stat stick, and if you are a generic basic assassin like Zed or Talon or something, and your job is to kill one guy, this kills one guy really, really, really well. And that's it. Okay, so assassin itemization really does not change dramatically. It's just this becomes Yumu's, this becomes busted, and this becomes potentially a solution for some ranged champions' woes. And that's pretty nice. We're finally here on support items. These are the exciting things, but I'm not going to go alphabetically for these. It's important that we touch on Redemption first so we can contextualize some of the stuff higher up in the list. Redemption is pretty much unchanged. As a whole, they are trying to make support items a little more affordable so supports can buy more items in a game. Let's take a look at this. 2,300 gold. It now builds out of the new component Chalice of Harmony as well as Forbidden Idol. The health is a little bit higher. Mana regen unchanged. Heal shield power just adjusted. And the actual moment of healing is greater. That's pretty nice, right? It's not significantly greater, but it becomes like, you know, plus 60 and then the heal power amps. 60 on level 18 targets. Nice. Then it also has the Harmony passive, which in the old days of League, when this was here, was really, really, really nice to have. It just made you a lot more durable. Now, Soraka didn't gain any value from this, but the General Enchanter was not unhappy, right? What's missing from this? What's missing is ability haste. There is no ability haste on this at all. Okay, so yeah, everything about Redemption is slightly better, except no ability haste on the most haste-reliant class in the game, right? Let's look at Mikael's. Mikael's was secretly broken as hell, right? I would build Mikhail's on Darius in endgame sometimes. Like, Mikhail's, if you had healing and you needed MR, was actually just generically good. So it no longer has MR, so that option for just the miscellaneous tank is no longer there. Rest in peace, Mikhail's Rel, which is a little unfortunate. Coupled with her mid-scope, but, you know. Having the Chalice of Harmony is actually kind of nice for it again, you know, Harmony passive. The power of the heal is also increased. Heal and shield power, mana regen unchanged, right? It now has health, nice, all that stuff. What's missing? Ability haste. Now, why is it really relevant that I'm pointing out that Redemption and Mikhail's no longer have ability haste on the most haste-reliant class in the game? It's because one of the critical properties of Ardent, one of the critical weaknesses of Ardent, was the lack of haste. Mikhail's and Redemption were relative to Ardent so much better that it's not even funny. Remember, the core issues of Ardent, no haste, 3-wide build path on a role that does have to pick up occasional pinks and that always interferes, and just the concept that damage is usually less relevant to provide to your marksmen when their items are loaded with damage than survivability. But now, keeping in mind that that comparison isn't quite as good, Ardent Censer, 2,100 gold, right? It's cheaper. There's an Ether Wisp in it. Ether Wisp Forbidden Idol, 2-wide, a 2-wide Ardent, okay? Lower AP, but whatever. Lower mana regen. There's movement speed on it, okay? Baseline plus 5% attack speed at early levels. Oh goodness, on-hit increased by 10. Now, small amounts of on-hits add up quickly, right? So Ardent no longer has some of the comparison points that make it just objectively garbage. One of its biggest issues is gone, and now the damage is actually kind of high. And number one Ardent hater in the house actually thinks Ardent Censer is kind of a good item. I unironically think Ardent Censer has a place and is not bad. The greater context, though, is that AD carries just lost a lot of survivability, right? So the survivability provided by Redemption and Mikhail's are more important, right? But I mean, if your kit is enough, I think it's acceptable to greed for Ardent now. I really do. I really do. Now, because I went out of order on everything, let's talk about Abyssal Mask. And, like, it's kind of funny, right? 2,400 gold. There is lower health, which kind of sucks, but as a raw MR stat stick, 60 MR. Plus, if you're a melee champ, it's most likely that you're actually going to have 70 MR, or 69 MR. Nice, but, you know. It no longer has Eternity, but just to be clear, this is a very, very cheap source of a lot of MR. You have to compare it to Force of Nature, but we're about to see Force of Nature being a weaker option as a whole. Chalice of Blessing, new component, 900 gold, Ruby Crystal Fairy Charm. Now it has the Harmony passive. It's your source of durability on an enchanter, and it's going to build into a lot of our items. Cool. It's a component, not much to say. It's kind of nice. Chemtech Putrifier is still unchanged on its really garbage proc conditions, unfortunately. And the mana regen is lower. The heal shield power is up, which is kind of nice. AP lower, it's cheaper. You know, I'm not going to really write home about this. It's back! Oh, my beloved Athenes, my beloved. This, you wouldn't know it. Like, unless you heard me ranting in our Discord. Especially since I haven't been talking about it and I've been, like, very low-key leading up to it. But, like, this is the greatest day of my life. This is the greatest day of my life. Just, Athene's Unholy Grail was just simply one of the best items for so many enchanters. And now we have effectively the same thing again. Echoes of Helia. 2,300 gold, Chalice Bandleglass, 30 AP, 200 health, 15 haste, 125% base mana regen, and this effect, Soul Siphon, dealing damage to an enemy champion grants a soul shard up to 2 max. Healing or shielding an ally consumes all soul shards to heal them and deal magic damage per shard to the nearest enemy champion. You will need to apply damage often to get this, right? A champion like Lulu can pretty much instantaneously gain it from one auto attack, right? If you double tap with your Q, you're probably going to stack it immediately, right? As it before, it disables Harmony, and it grants a very, very excellent mythic passive for enchanters in Ability Haste, right? This item is fantastic. It is so, so good. It is so beautiful. As long as you have the means to continually proc everything, it is so, so good, right? Now, you're going to have to be able to apply your own damage. So we just had a comment about Melio. Unfortunately, Melio is going to really struggle to proc it as the game goes on. Why? Because his burn damage doesn't count as his if it's applied by somebody else. So that's not actually gaining him soul shards. So he's going to have to manually hit somebody with his passive, and that is not an easy ask in the mid game, right? That's not even an easy ask in a lot of lane phase scenarios. Coupled with Melio being one of the best Shurelia's users in the game, I find it hard to find him building that often, right? And Taric too. Taric would definitely be a good user of it if he is allowed to stay alive. But you also have to point out that this doesn't heal him. So champions that would be amazing with this item, right? Karma was historically a great user. Nami was historically a great user. Senna is actually going to start looking at this because on release, there was like a very niche Athene's Duskblade build, which is going to be nice. Notably, Nidalee is not as happy with this version of the item as she was with old Athene's. So Nidalee is at her best when her enchanter elements are viable, because then the unreliability of her assassin elements are covered for. So now you just have an enchanter with good assassination potential, and that's very compelling. But the old Athenes required Nidalee to hit one spear and then just get a gigantic boost to her heal, while this doesn't do, precisely the same. You have to stay in combat more often, right? Lux is good with Echoes of Helia. Just genuinely phenomenal item. Ashe could be good with, Ashe is good with Echoes of Helia as long as that Font of Life can be procced by somebody, as long as there are auto attackers to use this, right? Okay, Even Shroud. Cheaper, unchanged on pretty much everything. It's using the new Lifewell Pendant component rather than Aegis. That's unchanged. Everything's unchanged. Everything's unchanged, except it's cheaper, and they just wanted to write everything out for some reason. Okay. So how do I put this? Mandate might be the single best item in the game after this. Mandate is no longer a mythic. Its build path now has Bandoglass, Fiendish. It no longer has health, but the AP is better, so the stat profile is better for its best users. And all it lost, really, in that conversion is 30 damage at early levels on Coordinated Fire. So, let's take a look at the implications. You're playing Lux. You're allowed to build Mandate Helia. You're allowed to build Mandate Ludens. My stance on Mandate is already clear. I thought Mandate was just universally better than Ludens on supports if your carry played at your range. So, Vel'Koz's Mandate was outstanding, provided that you had a poke partner. If you didn't have a poke partner, he had Night Harvester, which was also better than Ludens in that context, just because the Lost Chapter is a poor component on support, but that's another topic, right? The point is, Mandate was just genuinely outstanding before. But now it's 900 gold cheaper than your Mage Mythics and doesn't lock you out of them, which in support role is absurd. And even outside of support role, the few champions that like Mandate Rylai's, like for example Swain, and fight regularly alongside their teammates rather than in 1v1s, it is so strong on this price point. There is so much damage on this price point. Yuumi, Nami, Lux, Ashe, Vel'Koz, there's Zyra burst windows, right, where she'd prefer that. It doesn't lock Zyra out of Liandry's anymore. This doesn't lock Zyra out of Liandry's. Can we please appreciate how absurd that is, right? I'm not going to do it today, but long-term, it's genuinely worth exploring Mandate's role in just regular mage itemization. Okay, but moving on. We have Knight's Vow, which is slightly cheaper. It now has armor. It has slightly less health. The build path is now Lifewell Pendant, Crystalline Bracer, so that Kindle Gem is gone. The haste is reduced. The health regen is a little lower. The pledge itself is unchanged. And the actual change is redirecting pre-mitigation damage to post... No, changing from post-mitigation to pre-mitigation damage. You redirect pre-mitigation damage, heal for 10% of the damage dealt, which is post-mitigation. Oh, it's making you take pre-mitigation damage now to account for the armor that you have. Okay. So I was about to say, that reads as a nerf, but it's cheaper now, and it still does the same thing, and that's still an appealing thing for it to do, and the stat profile is a little more balanced. It does more things, which is kind of cool. Wait, hang on. Something's up here. So the stat profile is better, but it's now redirecting more damage to you, but it's redirecting true damage, so this doesn't even factor in. Knight's Vow is just killing you a little bit faster. In terms of its raw passive, which is like the point of building it, so that's weird. I don't know how to feel about that. It's my gut reaction. I guess we'll just have to feel it out to see if it matters. Lifewell Pendant is now just a component. It gives you some health, it gives you some armor, and it gives you a tiny amount of A haste. So honestly, kind of a compelling component to complete. Like, it's more compelling early than Kindle Gem, and yeah, it lets us build into our mythics. It's kind of neat. Locket is going to 2,300 gold. The build path now has a Lifewell Pendant in it. And since that has a ruby crystal in it, you know, we're just going to build... We don't have to do, like, ruby, cloth, null. Okay, well, it's effectively still ruby, cloth, null, like, looking at this more carefully. There's just less haste in the build path. So all of the stats are unchanged. The shielding is going up a little bit, which is nice. And it's still going to be the foundation of our melee support conversations. If Locket is tuned well... Locket is your baseline. Moonstone Renewer. This is very, very changed. So, 2,300 gold, Bandoglass Kindle Gem. AP is a little bit lower, health unchanged, A haste unchanged, base mana regen changed. But Starlit Grace is a different ability, right? Healing or shielding an ally, chains to the nearest ally champion, excluding yourself. Healing for 20 to 35% based on ally target's level, or shielding 30 to 40% of the original amount. It also empowers your legendaries with 5 ability haste, so, you know, choosing between Moonstone and Echoes is not going to lock you out of a very, very good mythic passive. So it is what it is, right? This, relative to Echoes, is going to be better on champions who just, like, absolutely spamming their cooldowns, right? So the only champions who are going to, like, giga default to this are over Echoes in, like, every situation are going to be, like, Soraka, Sona. There was one other that I had in mind, and I've, like, completely allowed them to slip my mind. But basically champions like that. Champions who are just absolutely dumping, like, continual sustained healing and shielding, right? They're saying Moonstone is a safer chain healing item, whereas Echoes is for when you want to fight and provide more damage. So this point is, you know, also technically true. If you are playing a champion who would value Echoes of Helia, but you are for some reason in a match where you know you are never going to be able to actually damage the enemy, then you are on either Shurelya's or Moonstone instead. Yeah, do you see the slight blue around them? Yep. Every single instance of that heal or shield is causing a chain effect exactly as I expected. This is why you do not build Echoes of Helia on Sona. I expect Moonstone to be, like, probably the most situational. The state that Enchanter Mythics are in now is you have one generalist item that everybody can proc. That's Shurelya's. And then you have Echoes of Helia, which is going to be really amazing for any form of combat. And then you have Moonstone Renewer, which is going to be really amazing for those few champions who are just, like, really outputting a ton of healing and shielding, right? Now, even on something like Yuumi, right? Echoes of Helia is going to be really amazing in most cases, but you could also potentially find a situation where Shurelya's happens to be more valuable, and I don't know why I'm trying to scroll up to Shurelya's when it's not in these patch notes. Or if it was, and it is, it's down, like... We will have a per-game decision to make. Just remember, even on the Helia champions, there will be situations in which you can't hit. On the Moonstone champions, you're always going Moonstone. On the champions who can use Moonstone, but you're not, like, just dumping out heals and shields, like, 24/7, you'll probably find options, but we'll be defaulting more to Shirelias and stuff. I don't know, but like, I like the idea of us having creative options, but some champions just pick one of them, right? Like, that's fine. That's nice. It's nice to have more options now that Mandate is not taking up an Enchanter Mythic slot when it realistically wasn't, like, an Enchanter Mythic, right? Radiant Virtue. So, they have put us into an interesting situation, right? 2,700 gold. It is an Aegis. It is technically a greedy option, but it's still well within the realm of affordability for supports, right? The health is a little lower, but the armor MR are unchanged. The haste is a little lower. You are transcending for less HP, right? 12.5% rather than 15. You are healing for 2.5% of your maximum health instead of 3%. Okay, so I misread this. I thought they were increasing the healing amount. Instead, they're just making Radiant Virtue cheaper, and it scales slightly worse with other items. So, in that case, my expectation will be that Radiant Virtue is simply still too greedy. The value of Radiant Virtue is personal durability. The output is not better than Locket if you are not a champion who's getting a lot of stats, right? So on supports, you are gaining generally more value from Locket. Unless, for some reason, the greedy value of this is something that is appealing to you. So, for example, on Rel, that's true. Yeah, I thought we were... when I misread this, I thought we were just transitioning to a Radiant Virtue better than Locket always situation again, like it was when it first released. But since we're not in that case, I don't really want to see a lot of Radiant on support. We've been over Redemption. Here's Shirelia's, which is unchanged pretty much always, right? Motivate is slightly weaker. Okay. And the AP is slightly lower, and it's also cheaper. You're still building this, like, as your default until one of the other options are overpowered, right? Staff of Flowing Water. It now costs 2,100 gold, just like Ardent, which is insane. It's now also too wide, so it had the same problem. That's solved. The AP is 15 lower. The mana regen is down. The movement speed, there's now movement speed, and it now grants 5 extra AP at early levels. Okay. So, although Ardent got quite a bit of extra value, I do not think the same is true for Staff of Flowing Water. Why? Because Staff of Flowing Water was already always, like, the greedy AP option. And, like, Staff and Ardent both had the issue with kind of being a little bit bad. But this was greedier, and now losing the greedy stats and gaining in exchange 5. You know, minus 15, plus 5. Do the math. I don't think this movement speed compensates. I can't believe I'm saying this, given #1 Ardent hater. I think we're absolutely in a world where Ardent is just universally a better option than Staff of Flowing Water. Right? Which, wild, but I would probably only build this item if you have run out of other items to build. Which feels bad. I think there's some Font of Life weird abuse cases that are a little underexplored, but it's so expensive, not in terms of cost, just in terms of the level of investment it takes to get consistent value out of this, especially since the proccing spell doesn't gain value from the ability haste, which is what you would really value as an enchanter, especially since, you know, if you're Melio especially, and you hit your E on somebody, it's very easy to miss the window where the haste matters, and blech. Watchful Wardstone now just does more initially, right? Watchful Wardstone can only be purchased after completing your support quest. Wait, really? So what's the difference? Oh, you have to upgrade manually. Okay, so Watchful Wardstone costs 1,100 gold. Pretty much everything's unchanged. It now has base mana regen, and it now has some of Blessing of Ishtal. It now has 8%, whereas original Vigilant had 12. So it's a little bit weaker initially. And they're trying to make you spend more gold to get all of it because supports are spending less gold as a whole. So Vigilant was changed from an auto upgrade. You now have to spend 1,200 gold to get it. The most important part is that it's now called Chosen of Ishtal. It's now a 20% increase rather than a 12%, so it's, you know, even better. Big increase to your haste, AP, AD, bonus health. Nice. I mean, I'm going to be building Wardstone anyway. I encourage you to do the same at, like, the actual end of the game. It's just, when do we ever get to the actual end of the game? Like, it was never bad, but now it's better. We just had a long conversation about Zeke's, which has historically been a pretty poor item, mainly because I recognize that it was better than I thought it was. That said, the changes don't really change that niche at all, right? It is a cheaper item, the health is lower, the armor is higher, the haste is lower, the mana unchanged, you still pick a conduit, and you still have an unchanged convergence effect. The thing that psyched me out was like, wait, that's a very big on-hit. Can this item really be bad? Yes, because a lot of the times in the spaces where you're applying this, you're immobilizing somebody, so either that guy's going to be dead anyway, the damage is a little bit redundant, or you're spending your CC on a fellow frontliner who you probably shouldn't be CCing unless the fight's already won, in which case Zeke's doesn't matter. That said, it means that Zeke's has a wombo niche. That said, it means that against particularly durable comps, it can maybe be worth it, right? But generally, the value of a Frozen Heart or a Knight's Vow or of a utility item like that, of Redemption, is greater. It's a similar argument to why Ardent was bad until, you know, Ardent just got buffed and is better relative to its competitors. But Zeke's is not better relative to its competitors just yet. And so ultimately, that won't change. Still, has more of a place than I accepted, but this patch changes none of that. Alright, let's speed through the small items. Okay, Sunderer damage is just going up. They want it to be less of a tank counter in lane. And they are also reducing the max health damage. So it's now plus 35% base AD and minus 2% target maximum health. Okay. In the context of bruiser itemization, right? Competitors are like Gore Drinker, competitors are Trinity. Oh, right. We have to do Trinity versus Sunderer math. Yeah. It is Sunderer. Sunderer is a good item, but we have to do the Trinity math again. Fimbulwinter. The shield no longer consumes the user's mana. Quite nice. It's still just a raw health item in a system with better raw health options, right? Unless KV is a little worse. But Fimbulwinter's hard to stack in lane. It just... Tanks are already so weak in Season 13 in lane. You are so component heavy. We're probably not going back to Fimbulwinter. Force of Nature. This factors into the Abyssal Mask thing. It now costs 2,800 gold. The health is higher. The MR is lower. It takes longer to get to maximum stacks, and it no longer gives magic damage reduction, just bonus MR. You are paying for 90 magic resist and some high health, right? But this, for quite a lot cheaper, grants pretty much the same MR, right? Actually has a little more of an effect. So, I mean, Fawn is no longer universally just the best raw magic resist option, right? I think Abyssal Mask will end up taking its place to a certain degree. How much does this cost now, exactly? Well, the difference in price is only 100, like, it's 400 gold between those two items. Fawn does still have more health. So ultimately, this is still more of a one-stop shop. It still encompasses more of your tank stats at a 400 gold difference, which is potentially compelling. Remember that expected case, Abyssal Mask is 69 MR, not 60. I still lean slightly towards Abyssal Mask. Gore Drinker is being slightly decreased in price, and some of its awful mythic passive is being adjusted, so it's a less awful mythic passive. It's actually not that bad. Remember, we were complaining that its mythic passive was split between two stats, that it lost a lot of its haste. I don't think we really changed any of our opinions on this. Yeah. Hullbreaker, it is slightly buffed. It's receiving a new build path containing a winged moonplate, so it'll now grant some movement speed, and it'll grant you attack damage. I mean, in the very rare conditions where Hullbreaker is actually what you want to build, that'll feel kind of nice. LDR, it now increases physical and magic damage to compensate for the introduction of magic damage in marksman items. So it now adds to, you know, your energizer effects, your on-hit effects. Cool. It just lets it fit into the system a little more. Lost Chapter now costs 1,100, so that mages get an earlier spike. That's potent. Solo queue mages have been struggling a little bit, but pro play mages are definitely better. Competitive mages as a whole, even just regular amateur play, are usually a little bit more consistent. Not universally, you can play whatever you want in amateur play, but yeah, Lost Chapter. Cool. Maw of Malmortius, the cooldown is going up, the lifeline shield duration is down. Wow, that's a bit of an undeserved nerf, no? Rabadon's Death Cap just does more. Sterix did not need Tenacity, but here it is. Sterix is good. Please build Sterix. Stridebreaker AD a little bit up. What was my Stridebreaker versus Gore Drinker conversation here? It's a hyper-situational mythic for only core users who exploit its attack speed and utility. To gain greater value from Stride than Gore, the 20% attack speed, 40% slow, and 20 movement speed must outperform Omnivamp and a heal. So it can only gain value on champions who gain critical burst damage from attack speed, and who already have alternate defenses. That said, the 10 AD would then be assessed as basically a burst damage change in that context. And so it depends on the champion's total AD ratios whether that actually would be a meaningful patch, because we're now using our regular patch note fundamentals. If it gives you 40 burst damage, it does actually matter. So someone check Garen, I guess. Yeah, actually check Garen. This 10 AD might actually translate to some disgusting burst damage on Garen, now that I think about it. Okay, Trinity Force is just gaining a little bit of raw attack speed, a little bit of raw AD, and the threefold strike duration is going up to 5 seconds. Now, threefold strike was good, but it took a long time for it to outdamage Sunderer, and then you still had Sunderer's heal, which was far better than it, because there was a period before 12-13, I think, where Trinity could win the debate fairly often, but then Sunderer just became universally better, and I would expect to see Sunderer remain at that spot, unfortunately, with these numbers changes. On targets that have 900 health, that's where Sunderer starts to outperform until Trinity stacks, and then it's better against targets that have 1800 health. And then the heal, yeah, okay, we're still building Trinity. Or, sorry, we're still building Sunderer. Alright, and if all of that wasn't enough, we have fundamental strategic changes. So, mana regeneration in the fountain is going up. This means you have to wait less time to get full mana. That's just going to be a nice quality of life. They're trying to equalize the gap between resourceless and resourced champions. Nice, we don't have to think too much about that. Home Guard timer. As soon as plates are down, Home Guard is active. This is going to create more of a divide in the middle lane phase and the late lane phase, because the late lane phase is only the period in which the lane phase should be ending, post 14 minutes, right? So, I can't foresee exactly how we'll have to deal with that. It does mean the lane phase is probably going to end, though, very quickly, right? Blast Cone spawn times, the initial spawn over the river walls, right, is now 9 minutes. Now, which ones are those? Is the, like this one, right? It's this one, right? That's really significant for gank potential, and this one too. So it is harder for junglers to gank around vision, because just the options that they have for getting over here are not as good. Now, it was pretty trivially easy to pop these anyway, so you just have a little less of a chore to do, but that does matter. Going to 9 minutes, ouch. Minions. So this is a really, really, really big change, right? Short cooldown dash access, yes. Short cooldown dashes. If you have to spend a long cooldown, sucks to wait in that bush. So, obviously the fundamental way to play macro, as you started to learn how to play as a team, was to use your mid laner's prio to move to side lanes, right? Like, that was the most basic way to play a lot of common roaming mids. Except for the first spawn, mid lane minions will now meet at the same time as side lanes, so those speed up. This falls off after 14 minutes. This creates more of a divide between the middle and the late lane phase. It is now harder for your mid lane. I mean, it's really hard for me to assess the impact of this exactly, because, quite frankly, my team did not play at a level where we were actually capitalizing on minion behaviors properly. We were not setting up dives properly. We were not good. Not at that level. So, So it's hard for me to imagine, because I'm just imagining, like, you know, impulsive dive setups where it's like the mid laner pushes from neutral and makes it there. Like you can still obviously set up a play where the mid laner crashes first, right? It'll just require... It'll be a little more telegraphed. It is really difficult for me to foresee the impact of these changes right away. But the people at the top are talking about how this will make it much harder to generate 4-man dives on the bot lane. And there is talk of this just dramatically slowing down the game and favoring scaling. Just because, like, you know, how does Galio set up his dives perfectly? Like Talia gets worse quality roams, right? Like, if all is neutral, the enemy has to screw up to expose themselves to a roam. So it's just harder to play for side lanes in the early game. The jungler just becomes the champion with more agency, but even them, with the blast cone, it's harder. So, like, they're trying to... I don't love it when they keep making changes that just makes lanes more dependent on only themselves and limits interaction. But so be it, right? This also does change how side lane wave management works. It is easier to generate a crash from shallower positions in the lane more quickly, so the times in which you are supposed to recall are going to shift slightly. You might have to do a little bit more slow pushing to generate all of your recalls. And yes, minions will ignore call for help chant signals to target enemy champions. So when somebody fights back on a dive, your minions will not target them. You must fight them raw, right? It will still be possible to dive, especially in unskilled levels of play, where waves are just inherently not set up as well, right? But I'm very curious to see if this actually does shift top level more towards scaling, and if it makes it harder for passive amateur teams to be punished, right? I think we are going to have to kind of wait to see how it plays out, expecting that roaming from mid lane is harder. I'm sorry, but this change is just too sweeping to look at the text and know how it's going to play out. We must get experience. Turrets. Champion damage to turrets. Instead of just taking whichever was higher, they now deal their total AD plus 60% of their AP. They get both. So hybrids are not as unhappy with that. Yeah, that's just a small tower damage increase to, like, specifically hybrid Varus, right? Yeah. Turret plating. The plate rushdown resistances. As soon as you take a plate, the baseline resistance increase is quite a lot higher. Is that just 45 across the board? Yeah, that's increased at 45 all ranks. All ranks. No, 45 all number of champions. Right. So that gets a little bit excessive. It shouldn't affect small wins where one plate is taken, but should help you avoid losing your entire tower to a single push or rotation. Sure, I mean, it won't impact Herald at all. It'll just impact, like, Aphelios red-white rushdowns, and, like, that's pretty much it, right? And, you know, as much as I said, I strongly dislike more difficult interaction between lanes. At the very least, top laners are allowed to contribute to the lane phase a little bit more. So Unleashed Teleport cooldown is now scaling from 330 to 240. They're trying to make the cooldown a little more punishing as it comes online right away. But Unleashed at 10, I welcome this. Now, if you did not play last time top laners were allowed to teleport to bot lane, remember this, okay? When the enemy has push and they actually successfully crash into your turret, chances are they will have probably set up a ward, like, in your most distant bush, right? They can only set up TP wards onto you if they ever achieve push. So that's when you need to be alert. Now we have trinket changes, right? Oracle Lens has 2 charges, which is a big deal. And the charge recharge time is going up and yada yada, duration down. And, you know, so if you're actively hitting a ward, your team now gains vision of the ward. So you can, that's actually pretty good. That's pretty nice, right? Oracle, like, the moment of Oracle is a little bit weaker. It now has 2 charges. That said, you can use one of these charges to clear out TP wards for Unleashed Teleport, right? That's what you have to watch out for. Please be deliberate with playing around teleport during middle to late laning phase. As for how I actually feel about these Oracle changes, I mean, you're going to have to spend both of these anyway to sweep out an entire river, so it's a little worse at that, for sure. You're probably going to have to buy an extra pink or two from time to time, and, like, given that the charge recharge time is up, right? It's harder to clear out vision. Although, it's easier to clear out multiple small pockets of vision. So, some ebb and flow there. Farsight will now provide vision over walls. Farsight will ping champions. Upon detecting an enemy champion for the first time, Farsight will ping the enemy champion, expand its radius to 800 units, and then self-destruct. What? Okay, no more infinite Farsight. They don't just stay there forever until cleared out. That is funny as hell. How do I feel about that? Most of the impactful Farsights were placed in a moment anyway. You didn't really need them to sit anyway, so I suppose that's it, right? And that is it, everybody. That is the massive, massive, massive patch. My goodness. Again, as I said at the beginning, don't immediately cycle out all your champion pools. The thing I'm most concerned about strategically is if your mid lane pool is very roam heavy. Even so, don't cycle it out right away. Just kind of take a peek at how the game is playing out. Have some time to experiment. You guys should be spending like at least a week, if not two, if not the entire duration of the patch, right? Just getting used to how this game has changed and how it impacts your champions. And then once you're sure you have a solid idea, then you can start thinking about any potential champ pool cycling. Maybe something you used to play is quite a lot stronger and you'd like to bring it back. Sure. Maybe the way that you play is just not very favored and like you and your team can't make it work very well anymore, right? Then you would do some cycling and you would try to do some soul searching, find something new, right? But please don't cycle before you know for sure how this is playing out, right?